This interview is being conducted on behalf of the History Committee of the Health Physics Society. It is part of the committee's effort to conduct interviews of senior Health Physics Society members who have made significant contributions to the science and art of health physics. These interviews will be collected in the Health Physics Archives. This interview is taking place at the University of California School of Medicine in San Diego on September 22, 1999. I am conducting the interview at the request of the interviewee, Dr. Stannard, and of the History Committee. Dr. Stannard has been a member of the Society since 1957 and has been making significant contributions to the science and art of health physics since 1947. That's 52 years. He is a past president of the Society and a recipient of the Distinguished Scientific Achievement Award. It is a special honor and a privilege to conduct this interview of Dr. Stannard. I have known him almost exactly 50 years, beginning when I went to the University of Rochester in September 1949. And then in 1950, he asked me to become his first graduate student. That was the beginning of an almost continuous scientific relationship. And most important to me, it was the beginning of a valued friendship, which has included my family. Newell and I have agreed to partition the interview into 5 segments. First will be his early life and education. Second, his early professional career. Third, his contributions to education. Fourth, his research and publications. And fifth, his scientific and professional committee activities. At the conclusion, I would like to have him comment on several current issues. Newell, would you like to begin by telling us a little bit about your early life and education?
Thank you very much, Bill. I too have treasured this relationship. Doesn't seem like 50 years, but it is. My early life was spent mostly in an educational environment. My father was a chemistry teacher. My mother was a Latin teacher. And pretty usually when I got home from school, one or the other was asking me if I'd done my homework yet. When I was about 4, my dad got a job at Adelphi College. I was born in a little town in upstate New York called Owego, not to be confused with Oswego, which is up on Lake Ontario, but on the banks of the Susquehanna River between Binghamton and Elmira. But they moved to New York City. At that time, Adelphi College was in Brooklyn. I spent my elementary school and high school years in Brooklyn, and then went to Oberlin College in Oberlin, Ohio, as an undergraduate, and that was graduated in 1931. And in the middle of the Depression, there really wasn't an awful lot to do except go on and take some more education. So I went to Yale and spent a year. The reason for that was primarily that I switched my interests during the time at Oberlin. When first started, I was very interested in geology, and I still am, but there wasn't anything for geologists to do in those days except go and prospect for oil in some unwieldy part of the world. So I switched to a pre-medical major, but I had some background to make up in chemistry, so I wound up with a chemistry biology major. At the end of the year at Yale, it was a question of whether to go on with graduate work there or go elsewhere. A friend of mine had been to Harvard and seen their new biological institute and was very interested in it, and helped persuade me to apply for an assistantship there, and I did, and had 3 years at Harvard, finished a PhD in what was then called general physiology. It would now probably be called biophysics. It was in the application of physics and chemistry to biology and the life sciences. I had one brother. He went an entirely different route. And my early experiences, you ask, did I have some hobbies? Well, I was a train buff, and we had model railroads all over the house and in the basement. But I suspect one of my most compelling hobbies was doing chemistry experiments in the basement. My grandfather, Newell, was a cabinet maker, and he built me a chem bench down in the basement. And I probably should have been out playing baseball, but instead I was down there doing experiments and smelling up not just the basement, but the house. I was also a member of the rifle team in high school, but never carried it much beyond that. You ask why Oberlin?
Right.
The main reason was my dad went there. He graduated in 1900. And it seemed like a reasonable thing to follow in his footsteps. I've already mentioned how I got to Yale and to Harvard. I can remember many mentors in those years. Probably the ones that stand out was my graduate advisor at Harvard, which was Theodore Steer and William J. Crozier. They were in the Biology Institute. But also Bruce Dill, who was an exercise environmental physiologist working over in the fatigue laboratory, which was part of the Harvard Medical School, but it was also affiliated with the Biology Institute.
I think some of your early publications were Newell Stannard, as I remember.
Yes, my thesis work was in cell biology. I worked on metabolic systems in yeast.
Mm-hmm. I can appreciate that.
Yes. Yes, you did your thesis using that old friend.
Right. Let's move on to your career after leaving Harvard. Where were you first employed?
Well, I was first employed in the physiology department at the University of Rochester Medical School in Rochester, New York. Kind of a long story on how that happened, but that department was well known. Wallace O. Finn was the chairman.
You might.
Yes, I have a picture here of the members of the department. It was a large department for physiology departments in those days, not very large now. I worked primarily on metabolic systems in muscle in those days, and I suspect as a sideline got into metabolic systems in some other organisms, including Trichinella spiralis, which is a little parasite that you get from eating undercooked pork. And it turned out it had some rather interesting metabolic properties, but these all have nothing to do with health physics, because health physics didn't exist in those 1930 days.
Right. But then you left the University of Rochester and went where?
That's in 1939. I was happy at Rochester, but we had 25 people to teach 50 medical students, and I felt I wanted to get more responsibility. So I took a job down at Emory University in Atlanta as an assistant professor of pharmacology. And that was a real contrast. We had 3 faculty members for 50 medical students. And I tried to do some research, too. But that lasted into the beginning of the war years.
You were at Emory when World War II started?
Yes.
At least when the United States got into it.
Yes,
Pearl Harbor
we
Day.
were in Atlanta on Pearl Harbor Day.
Right. Then what happened?
Well,
you avoided being drafted.
I applied for a job in the Public Health Service, the U.S. Public Health Service at the National Institutes of Health, and was accepted right away. I always remember that because I got this acceptance telegram, report for duty immediately. I phoned up and said, well, how immediate is immediately? And they said, well, how about a week? And by Jiminy, we were in Washington, in Bethesda, in a week. And I never could do it now. But I was on the staff in the Division of Industrial Hygiene of the National Institutes of Health. We were doing primarily work for the Navy on oxygen equipment and aviators, protective clothing, and so forth. So it was definitely associated with the war effort. But as time went on, since most of the work was with the Navy, and we were getting into some fairly highly classified areas, the Navy people suggested I should apply for a commission in the Navy. And I did, and I was accepted and became a naval officer and was assigned to the Bureau of Medicine Surgery in downtown Washington. So the family could stay in Bethesda. It was more or less of the same, aviation medicine and toxicology, but perhaps more emphasis on problems of toxic gases, and did quite a little work with carbon monoxide and limits for carbon monoxide in the environment and in the blood, much the same as we worry about now in the health physics area.
But not all of your time was spent in Washington, though. Weren't you out in California here during that period?
No, we were still in Washington at the end of the war.
I mean, when you were in the Navy, didn't you come out here on some assignments?
Oh, yes. My first assignment, as a matter of fact, was to visit the Aerojet plant in Azusa, California, which I found very early meant A to Z USA. That was to study the carbon monoxide effluent from jet-assisted takeoff units. And we did more silly things in that field job. We had to learn as we went. But we found out that there was no real problem from the carbon monoxide because it was such a huge blast of air. It entrained air so that the effluent was very considerably diluted. But that was our first job, and that was followed by many other field jobs of one kind or another in the Navy.
But there, in that particular work, though, you did expose animals to these
Yes.
aerosols, so that really was your first introduction to inhalation toxicology.
In a way it was, yes.
Experimental.
Yes, that's right.
Then, after the war, did you go back to NIH?
Yes, we went back and worked back in cell biology for almost 2 years. I was mustered out of the Navy in '46, and in December '47, we moved back to Rochester, to the University of Rochester. The primary reason for that was the National Institutes of Health was a great place to work, but I missed the academic life and teaching. I wanted to go back where there was something more to do with students.
I was going to ask you, when you first heard of the atomic bomb, did you
that
hear of
was-
it when you were in the Navy?
Yes, we were living in Bethesda.
And you heard of the atomic bomb then?
We heard
But
about
not
it
during its development.
when everybody else did, when
Yeah.
it was dropped on Hiroshima.
Yeah. So then after the war you returned after the war you went to NIH, and then you went to University of Rochester.
Yes.
Why did you leave NIH and go to the University of Rochester? I think you were actually working with Kornberg and
Yes, well,
Arthur Kornberg and NIH.
I was working with Bernie Harker,
Okay.
who later was very closely associated with Kornberg.
Okay.
Because I'd known Kornberg as a student at Rochester when he was in the MD program, and have had little contacts with his life ever since, one way or another, mostly in keeping an interest in what he was doing. But he was doing the beginning work that he got the Nobel Prize for just about that time.
Well, when you went to Rochester, then you actually went to work for the Atomic Energy Project.
Yes.
Could you talk a little bit about the Atomic Energy Project, how it got started? Who motivated that?
Yes.
It seemed like sort of inconsistent with the other things that I remember on the campus there.
Well, it was strictly a wartime development. The people at Kodak, Eastman Kodak Company,
Jim Sterner,
and some others in Kodak and the Mies in the research laboratories, they got in touch with the president of the university and urged him to take part in this new project, which was, I think, just then been named the Manhattan Project.
That probably started, what, 1943?
Thereabouts.
Yeah.
They said it would emphasize biology and medicine. It would be, and health protection.
This maybe look familiar to you?
Oh, yes. This is a picture of the original buildings for the Atomic Energy Project. As you can see from the picture, they spared no expense in having beautiful architecture, but there were times when they had 300 people working in that building on 3 shifts a day.
Well, was it the Atomic Energy Project where you really began your significant efforts in education? And you worked with the staff there. I'll hand you this photograph showing some of the senior staff at the
This
project.
was a picture of the group in the pharmacology department. That was a little bit later on. When I first went to Rochester, I was in the biophysics division of the project, but I had a 2-prong appointment. The Atomic Energy Commission realized that with the new field of atomic energy, there was a great need for education and training, particularly in the life sciences. And Rochester, of the various projects that had developed during the war, was one of the few that was on a university campus. So they decided to put an effort into the graduate training, and not necessarily graduate, but all kinds of training at the University of Rochester. So one of the reasons I was attracted to coming back, since I wanted to go back to teaching too, was that they wanted to develop this program. That started in 1948.
Why was the U of R selected for the AEC Fellowship Program?
Probably for the reasons that I mentioned. They were there on a university campus, and they wanted to have a program in the life sciences, and the people there were all life scientists, biological scientists, of one kind or another.
Well, at the beginning of this fellowship program, it was radiological physics. When did the term health physics come along?
Well, it probably began in earnest when they developed in 1955 the Health Physics Society. But the term itself was already being used in the plants that were involved in the nuclear energy development. But the term was really a synonym for radiation protection, and it was not used as much at the time that you got your first fellowship.
Right.
The interest in all had been always in medical, and had been associated with departments of radiology. And these people, physicists, were interested in biomedical problems, were either biophysicists or radiological physicists.
Okay.
And hence the term was given to the early fellowship program of radiological physics. And it became health physics later on because there were more people called themselves health physicists.
Right. I don't think I heard the term until I went out to Hanford.
Mm-hmm.
I think the reason that program was so successful was because of the research that was being conducted in the Atomic Energy Project. It not only provided the staff, the competent staff that to teach the students, but the projects, the research themselves lend an awful lot to the enhancement of the education of the students. What were some of the major research projects that were conducted there?
Well, a lot. The major results during the war years was, of course, the toxicity, biological effects of uranium.
Right.
And they emphasized, became clear that the inhalation route was the most important route of intake. So the Rochester group pioneered inhalation toxicology experiments, but they also did many other substances. Beryllium was one. Other radioactive materials, they didn't do inhalation work in the early days. That came later on. The program, I inherited a research program with polonium, polonium-210, and they had been doing some work during the war, but that was all by intravenous injection and not by inhalation. But there was also a medical group that was interested in essentially radiobiology and biological effects, and of course the end result of a lot of the work was bearing on standard setting and radiation protection. But there was also an undercurrent of basic science, just doing it because you wanted to know.
Right.
And I think it was I think you're completely right, that there were a variety of opportunities, both in practical science and in basic science, for students to be exposed to research and to decide for themselves which they liked.
Right. Well, you didn't mention the genetic program, but there was in existence there too.
I didn't mention that.
That was certainly one of the early genetic effects studies.
Yes, it was one of the early large experiments of the effects of ionizing radiation, X-rays in this case,
right,
on heredity and inheritance of the hereditary changes. This was in the mouse. It really was the basis for the later experiment at Oak Ridge called the mega mouse experiment.
Right. During the years that the project existed and subsequently, I think something like 1,000 students went through there. Seems to me there were several classes of students in the sense there were the fellows, the health physics fellows from AEC and later, I guess. And then you said, I think one time there were some people from industry. Where else did the students come from?
Well, there was some, as you say, some people from that just came in. They were interested, but most of them had some sort of support.
Right.
And they began, many of them, on the radiological physics or health physics fellowships, and that led to a master's degree. And it became apparent they got interested in research. Many of them, they wanted to do research. So we petitioned the graduate school to approve a PhD program in radiation biology, which was the first one in the world. And of course, you took your degree in that field, and you were the first PhD in radiation biology in the world.
I well remember that.
I hope the world all remembers
well,
it too.
I remember it.
But the tracks were pretty well organized. There was pharmacology and radiation biology, biophysics. And so many of the individuals that started on the fellowships got other support from the university. We had enough funds from the Atomic Energy Commission to fund students beyond the master's level. So I think you had some support from that too.
I did, right. Before we move on to your own research, I thought maybe we might look at a couple photographs from students. And excuse me for showing that because I happen to be in it, but
well, yes, this is one of 3 students at one of the exposure chambers.
then second is a class photo I think, of the third fellowship class. You recognize some of your...
Yes, this
Bob
was
Thomas.
the 1950-51 class.
I note that Bob Thomas is among those, and you know,
Yeah.
Bob Thomas and I shared a laboratory for the years we were there.
I don't know, we've shared each other's lives.
And one more I'd like to show here is, and this one includes Bruce Wacholz. I bet you didn't notice that.
Yeah, I didn't notice. Now, this is, you'll know that we did have quite a few women in the program.
And then finally, just to indicate the kinds of things that the students were doing there, you can see they were doing animal research.
Yes.
At least animals, you were using animals in their
we used
laboratories.
plenty of animals in the early days. The trend now is more away from animals, of course.
You want to comment on what some of your students have done since they left Rochester?
Oh my.
Some of them have gone on to make significant contributions in radiation protection. You want to mention a few of them?
Well, certainly you come to mind first. When you
That's
left
because
Rochester.
I'm sitting close to you.
You went to Hanford, and your thesis involved the effects of X-rays on yeast permeability, but because you'd been to Rochester, you're supposed to know a lot about inhalation toxicology.
Right.
So as soon as you got to Hanford, after a year or so of doing something else, you became involved in their inhalation program and developed their inhalation program, which contributed greatly to the general knowledge of such necessary for setting standards.
Of course, Charlie Meinhold.
Charlie
is president of the
Meinhold
National
was in the
Council on
early
Radiation
group. He
Protection.
didn't do a PhD with us. He did a master's. Because Charlie is now president of the National Council on Radiation Protection and Measurements.
Right.
Marv Goldman comes to mind. Bruce Wacholz, you mentioned.
There's a whole list of them. How many have subsequently served as president of the society? Seems like there's
I think it's 8.
6. Yeah, I think 8. I think that's right.
Depending on whether Jen Ressler actually went to Rochester or not.
No, we adopted her if she didn't.
Yes.
And how many have received the Distinguished Scientific Achievement Award from the society? Seems like...
I think it was 6.
I think that's right. Yeah. I can think of 6 anyway.
Very happy about that.
Yeah. And we were counting the number of fellows yesterday when we were discussing this.
Yeah.
We counted 22 fellows of the society, which is a rather significant percentage of the total.
Well, I'm very proud of it. The fellows are, well, many societies have fellowship status.
Towards the end of your career at Rochester, you took on more broader responsibilities in education. You were associate dean for graduate
Yes.
studies.
Well, I had been in charge of developing the education program, and then I took a little time off from it, and to help develop what was called the radioactive inhalation section. And that was where we developed the so-called Alpha Laboratory. We have a couple pictures of it you might like to see in a
We'll
minute.
get back to that in a minute.
But Harry Blair, who was the director of the department, became ill. So it was pretty, and he had been pinch hitting for me on the education program, so it was pretty clear I had to go back to it. So I did. And just about the same time, the graduate school reorganized at the university, so they had an associate dean for graduate studies in each of the major schools of the university, and they together formed a council on graduate studies. And I was appointed the associate dean for graduate studies, which put me nominally in charge of all the graduate work in the university in the medical school. And I'm very proud of that because Rochester, I think, probably then and maybe still does, has a very large interest in graduate education in the medical school.
Right. Well, one of the activities in that program was the summer institutes. They went on for a number of years.
Yes, that was part of my activities as chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission's Committee on Education and Training. And among other things, I hope maybe we can discuss a little more the contributions that AEC made to education and training, because they were very significant. But the Summer Institute program was primarily a program for college and high school teachers with a philosophy that I think still is valid, that you're not going to do very much in getting to the general population, and you're not going to do as much in getting to the students if the teachers don't have a full understanding.
Very true.
So that really led to these double programs. And they had 8 or 10 summer institutes going on summer after summer.
We mentioned students a few minutes ago. We didn't mention the fact that you had a large contingency from the military, and you also had a large number of international students coming through that program from many countries.
The military sent individual medical officers, and so did the Public Health Service. But then the Defense Atomic Support Agency, DASA, decided that they wanted to have a formal course called Nuclear Science or Nuclear Energy as Applied to the Life Sciences or something like that. And these people came they were all moderately senior officers, physicians and others, pharmacists and veterinarians and all this. And they didn't march to class, but when it came to commencement, they wore their uniforms to commencement, so that made them stand out. And I always remember one of them wore the sword that came with the dress uniform for the Navy, and he went up the steps to get his diploma, and the sword kept banging on the steps going up, and they had the audience in stitches.
Then you retired, I think, in 1975 from the University of Rochester, and you received an appointment as Professor Emeritus in the School of Medicine and Dentistry. Then you came to San Diego.
Yeah, well, maybe I'd like to go back and say a little more about the international students we had. Many of the foreign governments heard about the program and sent people of various persuasions and interests, and we were greatly enriched. We had students from many, many countries. And in my job as Associate Dean for Graduate Studies, I heard some of the non-academic problems that came up, as well as they're trying to guide them and help them in their academic programs. That's I think, all I can think of at the moment for the international group.
Okay. Now, how about San Diego? How did you get out here?
Well, when I retired in '75, at that time my first wife, Grace, had had a stroke, and we were finding it rather difficult to manage the Rochester winters with a wheelchair. And we had a daughter that had moved out here to San Diego, so we got interested in possibly moving out here. And we tried a couple of years of going back and forth between Rochester and Florida, but made clear that that wasn't going to work, so we decided to try to move out here, and we did in the spring of 1977. And within a few months, I had an appointment here at UCSD in the Department of what was then Family Medicine. It's now Preventive and Family Medicine or Community Medicine. And I kept that appointment until just last year.
And see, that must
It was
have
a
been
courtesy
about 21
appointment.
years then.
21 years, yes. It was 40-some years at Rochester and about 21 here.
Can we move on then to some of your research and publications? I think what I'd like for you to emphasize is the research that is more relevant to radiation protection
Yes.
and some of the earlier work, which I regard very highly, but people probably may be more interested in the work with
I'm
polonium
sure, yes.
and the other.
Well, the first research that I think was definitely pertinent was the work we did with polonium-210 at Rochester.
Right.
And we did a somewhat unique thing, which I always think was a very good idea. Instead of publishing the papers in disparate journals, like chemistry here and physics here and so on, we got it all together as a supplement for the journal Radiation Research. And that was published in 1964. And there's a copy of it here. This is a bound copy. You see, it's not a big volume, but it's a substantial one. And that's divided up into, it starts with the physical-chemical properties, and then to the distribution excretion, and then to the acute toxicity and chronic toxicity. And one or two things I think should be mentioned. That work with polonium was a good chance to study an alpha emitter that did not localize in bone. There's so many of the alpha emitters localize in bone. This was a soft tissue seeker and therefore could imitate the effects of radon, which, as you know, has complications because it has daughter products that are bone seekers and complicates the picture. So in a sense, it was a chance to study more or less a pure soft tissue seeker that was also an alpha emitter. And we did some fairly long experiments, 300-400 days. We did a multiple dose experiment comparing the effects of giving the same total dose as single doses or as multiple doses. And I think the bottom line was pretty much that polonium was a good example to use for all alpha emitters except the bone seekers.
Right. I don't think any laboratory in the world did as much work on polonium as you people did. I think you essentially wrote the book on, as you pointed out here, on polonium.
Well, of course, polonium isn't used very much now, but it is in static eliminators.
Yes, that's right.
And many other applications around, and sometimes it gets loose, and there's a problem, and it has a terrible tendency to creep. I
remember that when you work in a hood and had it in a beaker, it could be as outside as well as inside.
Yes, when we look back on what we did in those days, I'm sure we couldn't do it now.
That's right. And speaking of that,
we wouldn't do it.
You went on to develop the Alpha Lab.
Yeah.
And I'd like to bring this to your attention because this facility was really the basis for the development of laboratories at Hanford, where we did inhalation studies, and also the one out at Lovelace. So this was really the
well, we didn't know it at the time.
We didn't know at the time, but really
it was developed. This is a picture of. It was developed on the theory that there'd be a pressure gradient between areas of high activity and low activity, so that there would always be a gradient carrying the possible contamination into the so-called hot corridor. And they had hoods on the outside of the hot corridor.
And this is
the hot corridor is in this picture here. Just a picture of some people suited up
Well, this certainly was a very important development because it did lead to our development of laboratories elsewhere to study these radioactive materials, particularly plutonium and other the fission products. And we were able to do it safely, and it all really goes back to the early developments here at Rochester.
Well, I think
and many of the staff and many of the people who went through Rochester went out to our laboratories.
Sure did, yes.
So it really
you
did.
went to Hanford, others went to Lovelace. And,
right.
I think that the work there in the inhalation group helped to prove that there's no substitute for doing the actual experiment. You can't theorize on the distribution, excretion, and effects of an inhaled material just from other data. You can't do it at the cellular level, at least not yet.
One other research effort was Operation Plumb Bob. You went out to the test site and participated in the studies there. You want to just briefly mention what was that all about?
I'd be glad to. Operation Plumb Bob was one of the test series at the Nevada test site. They decided that there was a lot of worry about what was called a one-point detonation of a nuclear weapon. This would be if the high explosive scattered plutonium around the landscape. And this actually did happen in a couple of instances, one at Thule, Greenland, and one at Palomar, Spain, and there were others that were classified, I guess still classified.
Maybe.
But the decision was to do a specific test that was called a safety test. It was not a nuclear explosion, but they did a test in a remote area of the Nevada test site and exploded a charge with plutonium and spread it around the landscape. We had the job of doing aerosol studies and doing inhalation of the materials by animals.
Several species of animals to the
we used rats and dogs and burros.
Right.
First time I knew a burro could talk. Probably the best outcome of that was, or the most important from the biomedical standpoint, was that we were all concerned about the pickup of contaminated dust by wind and the resuspension of materials that would be a hazard in the long run. Well, it turned out that the resuspension was really not very important, but that the cloud passage, when it first went by, was much more important than we thought it was.
Right.
And I guess the incident at Chernobyl maybe has confirmed that.
It certainly did. Besides publishing many papers in the journals, technical journals, you've written a number of books or edited them, and both. And
I've helped.
You might want to mention this one as being one of your environmental.
I did a little foray into environmental sciences. This is a book called Environmental Toxicity of Aquatic Radionuclides, and I helped to edit it along with Morton Miller, and it was the proceedings of a symposium we had at Rochester the year I retired.
Then this large volume right here is another one.
This was a big undertaking. This was a book in the Handbook of Experimental Pharmacology series, which went in every medical school library that subscribed to the Springer-Shalog series. And that had 3 editors, Hodge, Stannard, and Hirsch, all 3 at Rochester. And then we had many authors, with several others contributed to papers as well. So we had chapters in there.
I think this is the one that really deserves major attention if I can lift it.
Well,
you want to tell us how you got involved with this.
This was my retirement project. It was called Radioactivity and Health, the History, 2001 pages. Bill got me into it, really, with help from Bruce Wachholz.
I think Bruce Wachholz really stimulated this effort. I think so,
well,
very definitely.
It started as saying there was some work done during the war that hadn't gotten properly written up. And we should have a history of the work with radioactive materials before a lot of the people that were involved in it are gone. And one thing led to another. It was going to be about 300 pages, and then it was going to be 600, and it gradually grew. So it's took a total of 10 years. I've had a wonderful time doing it, and doing interviews first. It took about 2 years of interviewing people in the field, so it was sort of an oral history first, and then library research, and then the rest of it. And the book is now not in this huge volume, but it's in a form of 3 volumes, and is published by Battelle Press in Columbus, Ohio.
One other effort maybe you would mention, you went to Japan and gave a number of lectures.
Oh, yes. That was in the 60s. A course in radioisotope technology given for primarily radiologists and other physicians from the Western Pacific area of the World Health Organization. And it was sponsored by the World Health Organization, the International Atomic Energy Agency, and the Japanese government. It was held at Chiba City, where the National Institute of Radiological Sciences is. You've been there, right, I think.
Yes,
yes. That was a very interesting experience. We were there 2 months. We didn't learn too much Japanese, but we found that they could certainly keep us busy. We tried to do a laboratory work that was approximately what we tried to do in Rochester, and the language problem, we should have known better, but we got a lot done. But whenever there was any kind of a break in the routine, the Japanese would have tour buses there to take us all to another factory to go through and see where they produced Toshiba or Sony. And so we learned a lot. I still remember many of those individuals, because many of them were essentially as old as I was. I was acted as director, but I couldn't have done it without the help from other people. There were 2 others from Rochester, George Casseret, who's a radiobiologist, and Herb Miramagan, who really was a radiological physicist of the old school. Right. And then for the public health aspects, we had Herman Hilleboe, who was the State Health Commissioner of New York State. And that was a pleasant experience. When we got back home, we were bowing to each other at the airport.
Let's go on to some of the committees that you served on. But first, I'd like to ask you, do you consider yourself a health physicist, a radiation biologist, toxicologist, cell biologist, or all of these, perhaps even more?
I think probably all 3.
And maybe even more.
At one time or another.
I think that it is of interest to hear people describe what they understand health physicists to be. Some of us shy away from calling ourselves a health physicist because I guess we view most health physicists as being more of the operational type. But I think it's a broad term that would describe the radiation biologists, other people who participate in the various disciplines that support health physics. Would you agree to that?
Yes, I'd certainly agree. It probably was more true a few years ago than it is now. I think the practicing health physicist is less likely to be involved in laboratory research than when you and I were most active in it. But I'd be proud to call myself any one of those three, but I've certainly had more contact with the Health Physics Society and Health Physics in recent years.
Well, I think I would say the same. You held several offices in the Health Physics Society. You were Society President back in, I think, the late 60s.
Yes.
And then you received the Distinguished Scientific Achievement Award, which I mentioned earlier. Then also the Sierra Nevada and Northern California chapters have honored you with a annual lecture at their spring meeting, I guess. What's the subject, what's the intent of that lecture series?
Well, the theme of it is excellence in radiation protection. And most of the papers are aimed that way. And that, of course, one way they get an audience for that is to hold it at Lake Tahoe. And a lot of people like to go there.
Of course.
And they have it in April when it's really a winter wonderland.
You've been very active in the National Council for Radiation Protection and Measurements. You chaired several committees. And
Yes.
you were, when you finished your term as your terms as a member, you were elected to honorary membership. And
Yes.
what were some of the committees you chaired? I think one in particular was Committee 57.
Yes, it was first Committee 34.
34.
Which was, broadly speaking, standards for internal emitters.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, a lot of people shy away from internal emitters because they have all these complications of distribution and excretion and solubility, and the dose is hard to measure. And well, they wanted a separate committee for internal emitters. And then they reorganized, and you had quite a bit to do with that reorganization when the committee